In a quiet town on a cold afternoon, an 81-year-old man walked into a store with nothing but an old coat, a worn document, and the silence of a forgotten war. When he asked for a veteran's discount, the cashier laughed, called it fake, and the manager told him to leave. He turned to walk away, humiliated, until the doors opened behind him, and a 4-star general walked in, followed by 300 soldiers. What happened next changed everything. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? At precisely 4:12 p.m., on a quiet Wednesday afternoon in the suburbs of Dayton, Ohio, 81-year-old Franklin Hawk Mercer stepped into Milltown Market wearing a threadbare field jacket that still smelled faintly of diesel, cordite, and old pine from a lifetime spent sleeping outdoors and walking into battles most people had never heard of and couldn't pronounce. And in his calloused, weather-beaten hand, he held a laminated discharge paper older than the cashier behind the counter, a document worn from decades of being folded and unfolded every Memorial Day by a man who still believed in handshakes, honor, and giving your word as currency. And though he walked with a limp that came from catching shrapnel during an extraction gone wrong in Cambodia in 1970, back when the operation didn't exist on paper and neither did the men who bled for it, he carried himself with the kind of quiet that made people feel either ashamed or curious. And as the automatic doors closed behind him with a swoosh, no one noticed the way his eyes scanned the store's corners, like a man who still expected ambushes even in aisle 9. Nor did they see the faint bulge beneath his coat where his old sidearm used to sit, though these days it was just a folded flag and a copy of his friend's obituary. The same friend who died screaming under a burning helicopter, while Franklin held his torn wrist together with a combat tourniquet made from his own shirt sleeve, a memory that haunted him more than the silence that followed. He didn't come for drama, didn't come to stir hearts or fight battles in supermarkets. He came for a coat that cost $42.17 after the advertised 20% veterans discount, and for the first time in 8 months he finally had enough saved from collecting cans, sharpening mower blades, and repairing old people's gutters. And he wanted that coat not for vanity or style, but because winter had come early this year, and the draft in his rented basement made his joints scream every morning. But the moment he placed the coat on the counter, things began unraveling. The cashier, a young man named Troy with gelled hair and AirPods tucked discreetly under his hoodie, squinted at the old document Franklin handed him, turned it over, held it up to the light like it was Monopoly money, then chuckled under his breath and said, "Come on, man. Anyone with a printer can make this at home." And though Franklin said nothing, the tension that built behind his eyes was louder than a shotgun being cocked in a quiet room, especially when the assistant manager, a clipboard-carrying, overly eager woman in a blazer 3 sizes too tight, chimed in, "Sir, unless you have a digital ID or barcode, we can't process this. We have policies." And the word policies landed like a slap across the cheek of a man who had once lived in holes for 9 weeks without sleep, who'd watched friends bleed out for unclear objectives, and who never once asked for anything except the chance to come home with all his parts intact. But he hadn't. Not really, because while his body made it back, his mind stayed curled in foxholes and napalm smoke, and every time someone questioned his legitimacy, it was like they were erasing not just him, but the ghosts of the men whose names weren't on any wall, whose medals were never mailed, whose families still believed they'd died of training accidents in places the government pretended they'd never been. And while the line behind him grew, people muttered. Phones came out and someone whispered, "Is he trying to scam the discount?" Another voice, a teenage girl with purple hair and eyes wide from something she didn't yet understand, said softly, I think he's telling the truth, but the manager snapped back. We've had these fakes before. They think wearing a jacket and acting all quiet will fool us. And that's when Franklin gently picked up the document, folded it with deliberate hands, and placed it back in his pocket like he was burying something sacred, turned to walk away, but froze as a commotion stirred outside. First came a military police vehicle, then another, then 2 black SUVs, and finally a staff car bearing flags, all pulling up with synchronized precision. Doors opening like a scene rehearsed for months, and from the lead SUV stepped a tall, steel-jawed man in full-dress blues, General Raymond Wells, 4 stars on each shoulder, boots gleaming, and a gaze that could freeze time, flanked by a small security detail and 3 decorated war veterans, including one who walked with prosthetic legs, and another in a wheelchair with silver oak leaves pinned to his lapel. And as they entered, the crowd instinctively parted, managers stiffened, and cameras started rolling without anyone knowing what they were filming yet. Only that something big was happening, something rare and old and full of gravity. And General Wells walked right up to Franklin without hesitation, removed his hat, and said, "Permission to stand in the presence of a hero," before snapping a salute that echoed like thunder against glass. A salute that made even the cashier's knees weaken, and in that frozen moment, Franklin returned the salute not out of pride but obligation, the kind of respect you show for men who remember you when the world doesn't. And Wells turned to the manager and cashier and said, loud enough for every phone and heart to capture, "You may not know this man's name, but I do. Sergeant First Class Franklin Mercer, 5th Recon, Operation Copper Dagger, March the 2nd, 1970. The man who carried my father on his back for 8 miles after a mine took out their vehicle, who saved 6 lives and disappeared because the mission never officially happened, who never asked for recognition, only peace, and with that, the general reached into his own coat and pulled out a service certificate, newly reissued, bearing all seals and confirmations, and handed it to Troy, who now looked pale, eyes darting like a man drowning without a rope. And then to the gasping crowd, Wells added, "Every soldier who goes unrecognized dishonors the oath we all took. You don't need a QR code to prove courage." And he turned to Franklin and said, "We've been looking for you for a long time. Hawk." And the nickname broke something in Franklin. A name he hadn't heard since the jungle, when radio calls carried the voices of boys who never got to be men. And for the first time in 30 years his eyes watered, not from pain or cold, but from the unbearable weight of being remembered. And as the general paid for the coat, draped it over Franklin's shoulders and whispered, "You were never forgotten. We were just late." The entire store stood in silence, the kind that wasn't empty but full of guilt, full of shame, full of respect they hadn't known they needed to feel until now. And outside on the sidewalk, dozens of active-duty soldiers, veterans and civilians had gathered, alerted through a single tweet from a military spouse who'd recognized Franklin from an old grainy photo once framed on her father's wall. And they stood in rows saluting as the old man stepped out, not like a customer leaving a store, but like a warrior returning from war, his new coat flapping in the wind like a banner, and his shadow stretching long across the concrete, as if every step carried the weight of men who never made it home. And somewhere deep inside him, beyond the echoes of gunfire and screams, Franklin felt something he hadn't in decades. Not forgiveness, not pride, not even joy, but dignity, raw and unfiltered, handed back in the form of a coat, a salute, and the eyes of a nation finally looking where they should have all along.